Morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Maia Otarashvili. I'm Deputy Director of Research here at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and I'm also the Deputy Director of our Eurasia program. As you know, today we'll be talking about the U.S. sanctions on Russia, the latest round of sanctions on Russia, but also the relationship between the two countries under the Biden administration. As you saw from the event description, we will be focusing on the latest round of sanctions. On March 2nd, the Biden administration announced that it would sanction Russia in response to the poisoning of Alexey Navalny, which happened this past summer in August of 2020. Although these sanctions are not against any top Russian officials, the Russian government is likely to retaliate. We've seen another round of additional sanctions as well from the Department of Commerce. I'm sure many of you saw the interview with President Biden last week, where he was commenting about Putin. So we are starting to see a little bit of a feud going on between the two administrations, but I think we have just the right people to walk us through the current situation and also tell us what we should expect the relationship to be like going forward. So today I'm joined by Chris Miller, who is the director of our Eurasia program at FPRI. And we're also joined by Daniel Tannebaum, who is Oliver Wyman's global head of sanctions. So what we will do is turn it over to Chris first, then Daniel. Each of them will speak for about 5 minutes to answer some of these key questions that we laid out in this event description. And then we'll do a little bit of back and forth amongst the three of us, and then we will open up for Q&A. So your participation is very much encouraged. Please send in your questions using the Q&A feature, and I will try to get to as many of them as I can. So with that, Chris, welcome. Let me turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thanks, Maya, for chairing this event, and thanks, Dan, for participating as well. I'm looking forward to the conversation in what's a really complex and I think challenging topic for both the U.S. government as it tries to make policy, and also for analysts on the outside to understand what's driving U.S. policy, since there are so many different players in Washington that have a say in sanctions policy, but also B, understanding what the effects are, the effects on Russia, and also the impact on Russian decision-making about foreign policy. Ultimately, the really interesting part of sanctions is not just what the first order effects are, but what the second and third order effects are or will eventually become. And so I hope we can try to spell out today what some of those long-run effects might actually be. And there are a couple of interesting things to note about the most recent sanctions, which Maya mentioned were implemented earlier this month. On the one hand, the sanctions were targeted specifically around the attempted poisoning of Alexey Navalny, who's Russia's most prominent opposition politician. But sanctions are really, I think, best seen in a context more broad than that. They're part of a long-running U.S. strategy, both to restrain Russian power and also to shape Russian decision-making about Russia's foreign policy. And so what I thought I could do to start is just lay out a couple of ideas about why the United States is imposing sanctions on Russia, what the strategy is undergirding America's sanctions efforts. And I think what's crucial to recognize is that although we talk about sanctions as being one set of tools, in fact, there are a number of really different types of sanctions in place. And I think Dan will probably dive into some of the specifics of how they function. But what I'd like to do is illustrate the different mechanisms by which the US thinks it's affecting Russian behavior, because in fact, there are multiple mechanisms in play. And I think what's quite interesting is that different officials in the US government articulate different rationales for why the US is imposing sanctions. One type of sanctions that the US imposes, or one reason that the US imposes sanctions, is to punish Russia, and thereby the hope is that it will deter Russia for future behavior. The idea here is that if Russia does something, the United States responds in a painful way, Russia is less likely to act in that way in the future. Sanctions are in this scheme sort of a deterrence effort, deterring Russia from acting that way in the future. There's other rationales for sanctions that focus less on deterrence, though, and more on shifting Russia's calculus or shifting the capabilities that Russia has. And so a second rationale for certain types of sanctions is to shift the political debate inside Russia. And so we often hear American officials argue that they're going to sanction specific Russian officials or specific Russian business elites in an effort either to divide the Russian elite on foreign policy issues or to make it more costly for business leaders in Russia to support or to work with the Russian government. I think there's a lot of questions we could ask about whether this strategy has actually worked, but there's no doubt that it's been articulated and bought into by a number of key American policymakers, not only in the current administration, but also in previous administrations and in Congress too. And there's a third rationale for sanctions, which is much less frequently verbalized among policymakers in Washington, but which I think undergirds a lot of the rationale for sanctions in the United States, and that's to reduce Russia's long-term economic power and thus Russia's ability to wield military power over the long run. And individual sanctions of the type that we've seen imposed over the attempted assassination of Navalny earlier this month are not really that category, but the type of sanctions that the U.S. began imposing in 2014 that restrains Russia's ability to invest, that limits Russia's ability to extract oil from its oil fields, and that imposes tough export controls on Russian firms, which is not really a sanction. It's a different type of mechanism, but the effect is the same. It's to reduce Russia's long-term economic growth rate, and thus the theory goes over the long run, reduce Russia's ability to exercise power, both military power and political power on the international stage. And this third category of sanctions is, I think, for many American leaders more uncomfortable because the mechanism is to make Russia poorer and thereby make it harder for Russia to exercise power. But in fact, when you ask American political leaders, would you rather have Russia be wealthier and stronger? You'll find very few leaders who would articulate that goal. And so I think this third rationale is quite important in understanding a lot of the economically relevant sanctions designed to restrain Russia's economic growth and thereby restrict its ability to act in the geopolitical scene. And so I think it's worth us thinking about these three different rationales for sanctions. One is a deterrent, two as a means of trying to break apart political coalitions in Russia and change the political calculus in Moscow, and three as a means of reducing Russia's power in the long run. When we assess America's sanctions policy, I think the first question to ask when we look at the debate about whether sanctions work is to ask on in what rubric are we assessing sanctions efficacy? Because whichever of these three rubrics you use, you'll get a very different answer when looking at whether a certain set of sanctions does in fact work. So I'll stop there for now. I'm sure that Dan has a lot to add to that, and then looking forward to the discussion and to the questions after that.
Exactly. Thank you, Chris. Yes, let's turn it over to Dan.
And I just want to piggyback on the last point that Chris made, which is, I think, an important one of, do sanctions work? I've spent my entire career working in and around sanctions, starting at the Treasury Department when the U.S. was really beginning to gain traction with bolstering its foreign policy through sanctions, as well as increasing enforcement actions. And on Russia in particular, it's pretty clear that sanctions have had an adverse impact on the Russian economy. They've certainly slowed the growth of foreign businesses entering the market, but it does begin to make one go back and question what is the underlying objective of some of these programs. I mean, if you think about sanctions at their highest level, sanctions are imposed to force a change in behavior. Russia came back under sanctions in 2014 related to the annexation of Crimea. It's pretty clear that Crimea is not being given back to Ukraine anytime soon. Similarly, with the Navalny sanctions, it doesn't automatically mean that there's going to be any attempt to release Alexey Navalny anytime soon as well. I think it is important to note that the Biden administration has been more vocal about the actions against Russia, although I would argue that the measures taken on March 2nd were relatively light touch, even in comparison with some of the designations rolled out under the Trump administration. If you think about OVD and some of the other related designations, you had a pretty significant hit on the world's aluminum industry, albeit that wasn't planned. But certainly you can argue that there was a much more significant impact on Russia through the sanctions that were rolled out under the Trump administration thus far. Although obviously what we're already beginning to see is that return to multilateralism between the US and EU, which may hopefully drive a greater action or at least a result on the part of Russia. I know one of the questions that folks are certainly watching, is what some of these different sanctions actually mean. To Chris's point, there's sanctions from OFAC, from the State Department. Just, I believe last week, the Department of Commerce through BIS levied additional sanctions on Russian, German, and Swiss entities related to the Russian WMD and chemical weapons programs, in addition to some companies that were added to that list last summer. Those restrict export and re-export and in-country transfer of items subject to the Export Administration Act. You have the OFAC sanctions that focus on asset freeze. We've obviously seen historically debt and equity related restrictions on Russia through the sectoral sanctions that were rolled out in 2014. I think from my standpoint, if I think about where there's at least market fear of where the next step of sanctions will go, is to obviously focus on the debt market. And I know it sounds as if Russia's looking to release additional Euro bonds in the coming weeks. There's been issues in the past with the success of those bonds due to confusion on market investment and the viability in investment in some of those bonds. But obviously, there's still a possibility that the US could target Russian sovereign debt through sanctions, which could have a much more significant impact on the Russian economy. In terms of whether the retaliation would be, is certainly anyone's guess, but there's more significant measures that the Biden administration can take. Similarly, there's additional oligarchs that could be targeted with a closer tie to Putin that have assets in countries that are subject to asset freezing that could also be rolled out as well. Although I certainly sense a gun shyness out of Treasury, given how well that went the last time they tried to do oligarch sanctions, to the aforementioned point. I think also something to watch is how you have the additional banding together of Russia and China, which we saw this week, accusing the US and Europe of interfering in their domestic affairs, although I would argue that both Russia and China have been somewhat reserved in their response to US and EU sanctions to date and some of the counter sanctions that have been imposed. But whether it's related to further sanctions on election meddling, further sanctions related to Navalny, I think it is a big question mark of how much further the US will go, whether they're trying to back off and let Russia respond, or there'll be a more direct action. Obviously, we've seen Secretary Blinken this week threaten German companies related to Nord Stream 2, which is 95% plus complete. At this point, most major companies have pulled out of that effort, and seeing where the sanctions could be successful is anyone's guess. But I certainly see a lot of my colleagues in the compliance space waiting very carefully to see what the next steps could be. Russia sanctions, the birth of the sectoral program in 2014, really was the genesis of more surgical sanctions that were less broad sweeping, requiring a more significant effort of diligence being performed that were more scalpel-like in their approach, which also made it more hard to execute controls and compliance-related measures against. So there's a lot of folks that are waiting to see whether that's directionally where this program will go, and what that means from an execution standpoint as well.
Dan, thank you so much for that. I want to just jump in and follow up with you really quickly. You have served, you have advised, and institutions on sanctions matters in, over 25 countries in the Americas as well. Not just, so you don't just focus on Russia. With, your extensive experience in this area, would you be able to, I sort of want to zoom out a little bit and give our audience a chance to get a taste of your experience with other parts of the world in terms of the sanctions. Maybe you could give us some examples of some of the more successful sanctions packages that you've seen, or maybe some of the more disastrous ones, if you're willing to sort of divulge that information. But what would be your comment going beyond Russia and just looking at the larger phenomenon of sanctions?
Yeah, and I think, I think back to Secretary Liu's comments towards the end of the Obama administration in terms of his foreshadowing of sanctions overuse, which we certainly got a great flavor of in the Trump administration. The question, I still go back to the do sanctions broadly work? Having worked in Russia, dealing with U.S. sanctions issues, in China, dealing with U.S. sanctions issues, you certainly have a perception of the U.S. trying to force humanity to decide between doing business with the U.S. or doing business with hostile threats to the U.S., which obviously complicates matters as our economies have become more intertwined. I spend quite a lot of time on the U.S.-China corridor, both U.S. and European institutions operating in the mainland in Hong Kong, Chinese institutions operating in Europe and the U.S. You do have a bit of a staring contest in some of these broader issues. I think historically, you have seen almost every country in the world not really challenge the sovereignty of their institutions with extraterritoriality of U.S. sanctions. There's been messaging, but largely global financial institutions, global multinational companies adhere to U.S. policies, even if there isn't a direct U.S. presence, for fear of kind of drawing ire of the U.S. through designation, through enforcement action, through limiting of banking relationships. I do think we may be at a point where the U.S. has met its match with China, which, to the earlier point I raised, has been extremely measured in responding to the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, the at least initial Xinjiang sanctions, where Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz have been sanctioned twice in response to both of those actions. But with China now implementing the unreliable entity list, their equivalent of the OFAC SDN list, with the MOFCOM sanctions that can establish potential prosecutions and civil damages for compliance with foreign sanctions, really US and EU sanctions, you really may have a threat where companies really do begin to challenge the kind of primacy of US sanctions. And I'm even hearing from clients in China dealing with some of these issues, basically levying China is akin to Vegas. What happens there at this point, we don't need to know about, because even if we're under a global settlement agreement, we're not willing to challenge the Chinese government on some of these issues. But I do think sanctions have been largely ineffective. If I look to some of the more effective programs, I would argue that the Iranian sanctions with the UN Security Council members and the US that ultimately drove Iran to the negotiating table for the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action were extremely successful in bringing them to the table to force the deal. Obviously, that's been somewhat complicated by the last 4 years and the deal being tossed, but sanctions, in their effectiveness really have to go to what are they trying to achieve. And I do think over the last few years, there was a bigger question mark of what they were trying to achieve, whether they were political grievances like the ICC sanctions, which I'm still surprised have remained in the Biden administration. I would have expected those to be stricken. Or who can forget the Pastor Brunson sanctions of 3 summers ago, where we briefly destabilized the Turkish economy over the imprisonment of a pastor and the designation of 2 members of the Erdogan government. So I do think it is important to really understand what we're trying to achieve. In the Trump administration, it was critically important to look at the sanctions in writing and not just listen to what Mnuchin and others were saying, because you'd actually see some differences in how they were telegraphing these programs to the market versus what they actually meant. I think you'll have less of that in a Biden administration and certainly less unpredictability. But what they're trying to achieve, with the exception of Venezuela, that had a very clear objective, if Maduro left power, the Venezuelan sanctions would have been, in essence, largely lifted. You don't see a clear objective for some of these programs, which does complicate, whether these are designed to be levied in perpetuity or more temporal. I think that is a struggle when you begin to try and understand why these programs exist the way they do.
Thank you so much. I think that was really helpful. And while we are on the broader topic of sanctions, Chris, I want to get your take on the track record of the sanctions that the West has put on Russia, the many waves of the sanctions since the annexation of Crimea. You lay out the 3 central reasons why we would want to impose sanctions on Russia, whether that is as a deterrence effort or a way to shift political debate within Russia and the Russian calculus, and perhaps most importantly, to weaken the Russian economy and therefore make sure that Russia doesn't get to exercise power, particularly the military power in the long run. Those are three really big goals. How do you assess our track record, the track record of our sanctions so far?
Yeah, it's a big question, Maya, and I think to answer it, I'll break down the successes and the failures, because I think there are, at least you can argue that there are both. And part of the challenge is that a full assessment of sanctions is thus far too soon to tell with regard to Russia, because supporters of sanctions can always say, well, just wait a couple more years and they'll kick in. And it's impossible to verify that argument until we wait a couple more years and see what the results are. But I think we can say a couple things with a bit more granularity right now. The first is, if you look at the sanctions that the U.S. imposed on Russia in 2014, after the annexation of Crimea and the destabilization and the deployment of Russian forces in Ukraine's Donbass region, as a couple things. One is that sanctions have failed in the sense that they haven't forced Russia to give back Crimea or to leave the Donbass. Now, Russia is willing to sacrifice a whole lot to stay in Crimea, and so I don't think anyone in the U.S. government who put sanctions on Russia's actions in Crimea realistically thought they were going to simply via sanctions eject Russia from Crimea. So perhaps that's too strict a test to impose on sanctions working, if in fact no one realistically thought that Russia would be gone from Crimea by 2021 in the first place. With regard to the Donbass, it's a bit more complicated. On the one hand, it's very clear that Russia is still in the Donbass. It's still backing the puppet governments that it set up there in 2014 and 2015. On the other hand, supporters of sanctions can make 2 points in their favor. One is that when sanctions were imposed in 2014, it wasn't clear that Russia was going to stop in the Donbass. There was a lot of discussion in Moscow about taking half of Ukraine, for example. And so there's an argument to be made that the imposition of sanctions in 2014 changed Russia's calculus about how far it was willing to go in Ukraine, and thereby restricted Russia's the amount of territory that Russia actually grabbed. That's impossible to assess from the outside. Maybe at some point we'll have access to the minutes of the meeting between Putin and his generals in 2014. I kind of doubt it. But if we had that, that would be the type of evidence we'd need to assess what effect sanctions had on Russian decision-making in 2014. Without that evidence, which we don't have right now, it relies a fair amount on speculation, what we think Russia would have done had there been no sanctions. That's just, to be honest, it's hard to know. The second way in which sanctions clearly do have an effect on the Donbass question is that Russia constantly brings them up in the context of the Ukraine question. So we know that Russia wants to keep negotiating about Ukraine with the United States, in large part because sanctions are in place. And although Russia denies this, it also repeatedly complains about sanctions. So there is a sense in which sanctions keep bringing Russia to the table, even if having U.S. and Russian diplomats sit down at the same table hasn't led to any sort of progress on resolving the Ukraine question. But that's another argument in favor of sanctions having had some effect. I think an even stronger argument in favor of sanctions relates to the third rationale that I sketched out. And what's interesting is this is the rationale least frequently articulated by proponents of sanctions, but where the argument for sanctions is the strongest. And that's that sanctions make Russia poorer, thereby make it harder for Russia to sustain military spending over the long run, and degrade the economic basis of Russian power. What we've seen over the past 7 or 8 years since sanctions began to bite is that the average Russian has gotten poorer over that time period. If you look at inflation-adjusted disposable incomes, they've declined in Russia since 2013, sort of an extraordinary result. In most countries, that would lead the populace to take to the streets with pitchforks. It hasn't yet in Russia, although we do see, if you dig into the public opinion data, dissatisfaction growing. Now, it's impossible to draw any straight line from that data point to a reduction in Russian military power today. Russian military spending, depending on how you calculate it, which is sort of complicated, it certainly hasn't increased as a share of GDP since sanctions were imposed, or at least since 2015, the year after sanctions were imposed. It hasn't decreased much either. It's been broadly constant, I would argue. So there hasn't been a direct effect. But if you buy the analysis of institutions like the IMF that sanctions are cutting 0.5% or maybe a full percent off of Russian GDP growth every year. Over time, that's going to add up to a pretty substantial chunk of Russia's economy, and will make it harder for Russia to field more advanced military systems and a larger military. That effect hasn't been seen yet. That's the type of effect that would be visible over 10, 20, or 30 years. But insofar as it doesn't seem plausible that U.S. sanctions will be lifted anytime soon, it's not inconceivable that we'll have sanctions in place over that time horizon. And if so, proponents of sanctions might be able to argue with some credibility in a couple of decades that sanctions have in fact slowed Russia's economy and therefore limited Russia's military power. Now, from the perspective of today, that's not a very satisfying answer, because people want progress now. And I think that's where supporters of sanctions find their argument the hardest to make, which is that they're always having to argue, let's wait 5 more years, or let's wait 10 more years, and then we'll see results. And if we're honest, we just can't know what's going to happen in 5 or 10 years with any sort of certainty. That's a hard argument to sustain in Washington. People want answers next month or next week rather than next decade.
Thank you, Chris. I want to turn it over to Dan. For regimes like the current Russian regime, the regime stability greatly rests on the oligarchs, on how satisfied the oligarchs are with the country's leadership, also with the status quo, and how safe they feel with their wealth, not just in terms of maintaining their wealth, but also spending it all over the world, especially in the West. So I wanted to ask you to walk our audience through this notion of sanctioning the oligarchs, sanctioning the inner circle of, in this case, Putin. How that goes, what are some of the most common sanctions against the oligarchs? And again, what have you seen pay off? You said that there could be additional sanctions for, additional oligarchs. How do you anticipate that would play out? Do you think that would make much of a difference?
I think it depends on the who. If we look at the original round of oligarch sanctions, like 3 years ago now, obviously you had some fairly significant companies that were caught up in these sanctions. I mean, ideally, you're looking to deprive people close to Putin of capital, of the ability to transact globally, of the ability to not have assets frozen in jurisdictions where asset freezes may be in place, like the UK, EU, and certainly in the US. I think you've had certain scenarios. I think Vexelberg's a great example that's had over $1 billion in assets frozen since the original tranche of sanctions. There's questions in terms of the proximity to Putin, in terms of his relationship, whether the folks that Navalny's people listed as he was imprisoned were people that may have more direct impact. I don't think there's any clear evidence that sanctioning additional oligarchs may change the tact of the Russian regime. You've obviously seen some trying to safeguard their wealth, keeping out of Russia, living abroad. I've worked with one in particular who hides under heavily armed guard in London for fear of his personal safety on a few different fronts. But I think the theory on sanctioning additional oligarchs is that if people close to Putin are pressured and have significant limitations placed on their business efforts, that somehow that will make Putin react. I'm not sure if that's necessarily true. But again, there's more levers that I think can be pulled on the sanctions front related to some of the wealthier business owners that have significant interests with the West that could be adversely impacted should sanctions roll out. We've certainly seen a number of the holdings of the previous oligarchs that got designated take massive hits until they were able to restructure their businesses accordingly, in so much as they could exist without oligarch ownership. And that's likely what would happen again. Any of the larger multinational conglomerates that would get caught up would be forced to restructure, just like some of the others had, so that they can continue their existence, and that the oligarch owners divest to a portion where under US law, those holdings would be permissible and the business could still deal with the US. But again, I'm still skeptical of how much of an actual impact that may have on changing the calculus of how the Putin regime operates under this type of pressure.
Exactly. I want to turn it over to you, Chris. In 2014, as we sanctioned Russia, so did the European Union, and that seems to send a pretty powerful message, right? This coordination between these two sides was really helpful. Once we started seeing the sanctions fatigue set in, it was really some of the European nations that seems to have a problem with the sanctions early on before anybody else did. Right now, I would say there's quite a significant sanctions fatigue, not just in Europe, but even in the United States. We are now seeing plenty of analysis come out of Washington suggesting that, we either drop these sanctions or we use the sanctions as sort of leverage with Russia and promise to remove these sanctions in return for certain things. I want to get your take on where Europe is with the Russia sanctions, on how important you think it will be for the U.S. to coordinate with Europe going forward on any additional rounds of sanctions, and whether or not you anticipate that Europe will keep its sanctions in place when it comes to Russia.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Maya. I was to think back to 2014, which was a year that I spent living and working in Washington. And at that time, the constant debate was, when will the EU cancel its sanctions on Russia? And the potential answers to that question were this month or next month. It was inconceivable that the EU would keep its sanctions on Russia all the way through the 2020s. Especially in a context where there's been no progress whatsoever in resolving the Donbass issue, around which the most economically significant sanctions are tied. So I think on the one hand, it's actually surprising the amount of unity that the European Union has kept on the question of Russia sanctions. Now, as you said, there's a lot of division within the European Union. Different member states have different perspectives. In Central and Eastern Europe, and in the countries that were either formerly part of the Soviet Union or part of the Warsaw Pact, there's a whole lot of support for sanctions, in part because these countries are in general more hawkish on Russia. In parts of Southern Europe, Italy and Spain, Portugal, they don't really see Russia as much of a threat. They're much more focused in foreign policy terms on the Mediterranean and the Middle East. And they would rather prioritize economic ties with Russia than sanctions. And you have some swing players in Europe, countries like Germany, and to a lesser extent, France, which have been driving sanctions by supporting them. If Germany and France didn't support sanctions, sanctions would disappear. The fact that Germany in particular, and to a lesser extent France, continues to support sanctions has kept them in place. And I think it's worth asking, why has Germany kept its support for sanctions intact? I think there are two explanations which are not mutually exclusive. One is in the bureaucratic process of the European Union. Unlike in the US, where all it takes is the president's stroke of a pen to put any company in the world more or less on a sanctions list, the European Union has to hammer out agreement among 27 member states. And even though not every member state matters equally, there are a lot of important players who need to give their assent to sanctions before they're imposed. And so once the EU agrees on a sanctions consensus, it's really, really hard to unwind, because you have to unwind all of the different agreements that were made on the path to sanctions. And so there's a much more bureaucratic and much more complex negotiating process that keeps the EU sanctions regime much more tightly knit than in the US, where the president could wake up tomorrow morning, change his mind, and more or less rewrite the US sanctions regime. That's one.
But just to add on though, Chris, I mean, it is interesting. Every time the EU sanctions come up for renewal, it's almost, there's never debate. It's almost always universally passed and quickly. So it has been interesting just to watch that on the sidelines of how little fuss it's gotten just to continue with that regime and EU debate.
I think there are two explanations for that seem most important to me. One is that if you look in 2014, 2015, 2016, and even to a certain extent up to the present, the countries that were most vocal about opposing sanctions, countries like Hungary in particular, what they would do is they would send their foreign minister or their prime minister to Russia. They would have a meeting with Foreign Minister Lavrov. They would issue a very angry statement about European sanctions. and then the Germans would buy them off by giving them something else they wanted, and they would finally vote in favor of sanctions. And this was sort of a repetitive process. The Hungarian foreign minister regularly on the flight to Moscow, trying to pick up goodies from both Moscow and Berlin. And there's a fair amount of cynicism in a number of the EU states that were the most vocally opposed to sanctions were in reality in a process of selling to the highest bidder, and Germany could always bid more highly than Moscow. I think that's one facet of it. I think the second explanation is that the usual critique against sanctions is that they're very expensive for European companies, but the European states that are most exposed to trade with Russia are those that are the most hawkish on Russia. Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland. These are countries that border different parts of Russia. Their economies are more exposed to Russia than, say, Spain or Portugal. And so they've actually had more at stake, but have been willing to eat the economic cost. And for the Portuguese, Russia doesn't really matter in geopolitical terms, but it also doesn't really matter in economic terms. So they can sort of follow the consensus and rather not make any enemies in the European Union by taking a position that contradicts the mainstream view. So I think these intra-European dynamics are actually quite important in helping to maintain the consensus in Europe on the sanctions regime.
Thank you, Chris. So I'm going to start posing some of the questions that are coming in from our audience. So I want to encourage everyone to send in the questions they have. I actually received this one ahead of the event from one of our scholars, Dan Owen, and his question I think would be probably best for Dan to answer. It talks about how the role of sanctions often, more than anything, play in boosting organized crime, illicit trafficking, and related transnational criminal organizations. This only serves to further solidify what we call the iron triangles, right? Or these networks of illicit trade and smuggling and money laundering that is, especially in the Black Sea region, backed and supported by Kremlin. He says most studies I've read indicate that sanctions on authoritarian regimes rarely achieve their intended effect. We talked about that a little bit, but he also says that they generally backfire. How concerning is this to you, Dan, and what would you say, based on your experience, is a connection between, the greater number of sanctions versus, sort of higher rates of illicit trade and, money laundering, things like that?
No, it's a great question, and it's something I've definitely seen over the years, and it's been a policy-driven argument for so many years of all of the compliance-related issues that my clients, that banks like those on the line have had to deal with. How much of them are really related to circumvention tied to people trying to transact as normal as a direct result of sanctions, and it driving the activity to more illicit means that may have ordinarily been using more proper channels. I mean, there's been arguments made for years in that regard that obviously you wouldn't have some of what was deemed impermissible activity if the sanctions didn't exist, because they'd be permissible in the first place. I'm not sure that I've always bought into that argument. You've still seen scenarios where even in a situation where there were allegations of issues that may ultimately lead to sanctions, that some underlying money laundering and other illicit activity was already occurring, and that sanctions didn't necessarily exacerbate that. I think it's, I can't, especially with Russia, say that sanctions have driven any additional organized crime. We've obviously seen with the Nordic and Baltic banks significant penalties that have come out of Russian laundromat-related money laundering issues, that I don't know if that necessarily would have anything to do with the sanctions imposed on Russia, since so much business is still perfectly legal between a number of countries in Russia. Really, in Russia's case in particular, there's a lot that can be done that isn't restricted. Obviously, establishing debtor equity-related transactions for some companies still remains restricted, but on the whole, I think quite a bit of commerce is still allowed. So at least my position would be that I don't necessarily buy with Russia that the sanctions have forced or driven additional transnational crime as a result. I think some of that would have continued with or without sanctions. and is somewhat separated from that. But that's just this man's view on the topic.
Thank you very much. So we have quite a few really good questions, so I'm going to couple some of them, but let me start with this one from Daniel McGlinchey. How did the targeted sovereign debt sanctions work back in 2014, as opposed to what's been talked about more lately, i.e. a general prohibition against U.S. persons dealing in new Russian sovereign debt? If the U.S. goes down the latter route, do you prohibit secondary debt markets as well?
So Dan, I'm happy to, I'm happy to start that, and Chris, feel free to jump in. How the program was rolled out in 2014, the birth of sectoral sanctions, was really to tighten the ability for some key strategic Russian defense, oil and gas, and financial services institutions to kind of have access to credit in the West. And so restrictions were put in place tied to the issuance of credit, tied to the issuance of debt and share listings and offerings to really limit the access to capital for some of those companies. But again, it was very specific companies and very specific type of transactions. So if you looked at Gazprom, for instance, there was still a substantial amount of business that could be done with US companies and Gazprom. However, payment terms needed to be structured in a way that companies would be found on the right side of sanctions. There were scenarios where payment was received for permissible services outside of those restrictions, and thus funds had to be blocked. Obviously, then businesses learned to accept cash in advance for some of the services rendered, so you didn't end up having a scenario where these restrictions have evolved. But I think the punchline with the 2014 sanctions is these were not all-out blocking prohibitions. These were very limited to debt or equity transactions, and a whole range of business was permitted. When you begin to look at more significant sanctions that are done through broader OFAC authority, you may have full asset freezes that come into the mix. We've also obviously seen, as I mentioned, export control related restrictions. So again, restrictions in dealing with certain Russian businesses, but only in certain types of only in the exportation of certain types of goods. So financial services related transactions may be permissible, but it may be only focused on restricting certain types of trade. I think Russia, being such an advanced economy, has really forced the creativity in how sanctions have rolled out. Unlike in Iran, unlike in how Cuba rolled out, where the sanctions were very broad sweeping, Russia was far too significant a global economy to try and touch like in a broad sweeping SDN program where you had all out blocking prohibitions.
I think one thing I would add on top of that is, you know, there's the specific limitations that sanctions have imposed on dealing in sovereign debt markets, and perhaps that could be expanded. There's been legislation in Congress in recent years to do so. I think in addition to that, we should also consider the ways in which the threat of sanctions has changed Russian macroeconomic policy. And so what you find if you compare Russia to many other emerging markets that are economically comparable is that Russia has far less public debt and generally runs far lower government budget deficits than almost all of its peers. And I think it's pretty clear why. It's that the Russian government is afraid of future financial sanctions that would cut it off from international debt markets. And so as a result has set aside around $500 billion in various government savings funds to make sure that if such sanctions do come, it's prepared financially.
Thank you both. I have two questions from Salome Bachgoria, who is an intern here at FPRI, so I'm going to combine her excellent questions. One, this is a very good question. We said that, you know, we've heard in response to these Navalny sanctions that Russia may sanction the United States. So Chris, maybe you could tell us whether or not you're hearing any talks about this within Russia. Second, this is really important, this idea that, you know, countries like Russia tend to then blame the West for the economic difficulties within the country, saying, look what the West did. They sanctioned us, and now look at the poverty or all these difficulties. And that narrative tends to sell pretty well in terms of sort of stroking more anti-Western sentiment and maybe letting the regime get away with a lot more. And, you know, Salome's question is, what are some of the ways that the West can fight against this kind of campaign. So, Chris, I'll turn this one to you.
I think on the question of Russian sanctions, the challenge Russia faces is that it can sanction its neighbors, and it has done that with economic impact. It's cut off imports of Georgian and Moldovan wine, for example, in recent years, or restricted the flow of labor migrants. And for Russia's neighbors, that has a big effect. But if Russia wants to sanction larger countries, either major European countries, the United States, it can't really do so without having a comparable or even a worse impact on itself. So the reality is that although Russia talks about sanctioning the US in response, it never really does anything that substantive because it would hurt Russia more. The best case study of this is in 2014, Russia responded to Western sanctions by prohibiting the importation of most agricultural and food products from Western countries. And the effect of this was to raise food prices in Russia and make Russians poorer. It wasn't a great case study in economic policy making. And I think that provides an example of the cost that Russia can impose on itself if it decides to sanctions. What makes sanctions unique for the United States is that in many cases it can impose a lot more cost on other countries than it actually has to suffer itself. And that's why sanctions are such an appealing tool to many in Washington. I've forgotten the second question, Maya. Can you remind me?
It was about, how can the West fight the information campaign?
This is interesting. I think if you polled the typical Russian in 2015 and 2016, who's to blame for our country's economic problems, Western powers would be at the top of the list. That argument has become much less potent in recent years as sanctions have receded into history. Obviously, they're still in place, but they're talked about much less frequently in Russian media and Russian discussions. And there's much more focus placed on more immediate events, whether it's COVID, whether it's oil prices, and also to an increasing degree, whether it's the Russian government's fault. So I think actually the passage of time has made that argument much less appealing to the typical Russian. And certainly we see that in public opinion data. Opinions of the United States aren't rising at all, but blame for the United States or for the West on Russia's economic problems, I think, is losing some of its potency in Russian politics.
Thank you, Chris. I have a question from Maria Shagina, who says, what role will Russia play in other sanctions regimes like Iran or Libya? And how will the need for cooperation with Russia in other conflicts affect the appetite for more Russia sanctions? So I'll turn this over to Dan first. And then after Dan, Chris, maybe you could talk about, some of these conflicts where Russia is involved, where the United States also has interests, whether it's Syria or elsewhere, and how you see the dynamic playing out. But let's
apologies, I missed that question as a fire alarm was going off in my house. So can you repeat that again?
No problem. So the question was, what role will Russia play in other sanctions regimes, like with Iran or with Libya? And how will the need for cooperation with Russia in other conflicts affect the appetite for more Russia sanctions?
It's certainly all interconnected. I mean, you're seeing Russia and China clearly band together, which may have some spillover effect. I do think there, in so much as the crossover risk that can exist from program to program, you do typically find different approaches of how these issues can exist. I mean, obviously, on some of these scenarios, you're talking about an issue where both Russia and Iran, for instance, could be under similar sanctions related to the same type of trade that they may be carrying out with each other. So it's an expansion potentially of the counterparty risk. But if you look at CATSA, for instance, which obviously banded together some of the different programs against Iran, Russia, North Korea, you're certainly trying to apply some of the same policy-related approaches, albeit with a different target. But I think certainly you're watching countries like China and its potential additional relationship with Russia to just see what that can mean from a knock-on standpoint to kind of worsen the relationship that the U.S. has with both parties right now.
Chris.
Yeah, I think on the question of Libya, I guess I'm not sure that sanctions are going to be a decisive factor in the eventual resolution of the Libyan conflict, if in fact it ever gets resolved. So I'm not sure that that sanctions are the crucial tool there. On Iran, I mean, I guess the interesting takeaway of the past 4 years is that it sort of doesn't really matter what any other country thinks, because U.S. financial sanctions are so powerful a tool, and they can be imposed unilaterally and have massive effects on financial markets. So there too, it does seem like, at least in the sense of what impact will the sanctions have economically, we sort of know that the answer doesn't really depend on Russia. Now, there's a different question about the politics. Do you need Russia to get Iran to the table politically, or to hammer out an agreement between the U.S. and Iran? You know, I think that's probably a question better directed to an Iran expert than to me, since I claim no expertise in that subject. But it doesn't really seem to be a question of sanctions as much as it does diplomacy around Iran and the nuclear question.
Chris, I want to build on that question. We wrote an edited volume, a book back in the fall about Russia's war in Syria, and sort of where that puts the United States and our interests. But you know, that book really was a part of this conversation about Russia's self-perception as a great power, and how it is trying to position itself around the world by involving itself in these key conflicts, so that it will have a seat at the decision-making table with the big guys like the United States. So as we talk about our need to sort of cooperate with Russia in certain issues, how do you see this? Do you think Russia has accomplished this? Do you think Russia has made itself an indispensable, ally or partner in certain parts of the world? Again, whether that's Africa, the Middle East, Latin America. How do you assess the current situation of Russia as a great power?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think I wouldn't use the word partner, because in most of these cases, adversary or competitor is probably the concept with which both people in Moscow and in Washington see things. But I think you're right in that Russia has made itself a player that must be reckoned with in many regions of the world, including regions where just 10 years ago, people have been surprised to hear Russia mentioned. Venezuela, for example. Russia's a player in a way that it hasn't been in Latin America for several decades. So in that sense, I think, yes, Russia is a key player in a number of these crucial regions of the world. I think when it comes to sanctions, I think the interesting part about this is that you often hear an argument from, particularly from Russian leaders, but also from some American critics of sanctions, that sanctions prevent dialogue between the U.S. and Russia. And I think the track record is actually the opposite. And you can argue that they spur dialogue just as much by drawing the Russians to complain about American behavior when it comes to sanctions and trying to get sanctions lifted. So I don't actually think that sanctions have obstructed conversation or negotiations between the U.S. and Russia. I think the real challenge is that on all the issues that you referenced, there's just a huge gap between where the mainstream American view is and the mainstream Russian view.
Thank you, Chris. I have a really good question that I want to pose to Dan. This is something that came to my mind as well as you were sort of describing the implications of monitoring these sanctions programs. So someone wants to know, it is very difficult, particularly, to ensure we did not do business with entities that involved specially designated nationals. So this person worked at a large multinational law department responsible for designing an effective compliance program. So the question is, how do the speakers view the burdens placed on multinationals for compliance when it comes to sanctioned entities? And you mentioned that especially when sanctions are sort of more precise and more custom, the amount of burden that creates on our side to monitor that. So how do you view this?
I think the simplest way of putting it is compliance officers have become deputy sheriffs. They've been forced to act as cops to police their clients and the transactions that they're a party to look for underlying violations. Now, I think that's only natural as the government implements the rules and commerce has to abide by them. So naturally, regulated institutions have to try and cover themselves and look for potential risk. However, I think in most jurisdictions, you have a fairly limited set of prescriptive standards of how you achieve that. So there actually is a pretty significant disconnect from a policy standpoint, which I've served, to the regulatory standpoint, which I've also served in terms of how you actually achieve this. As we know, and banks on the line will know this, billions of dollars a year are spent to identify risk in a way that's generally acceptable to regulators, but might not actually identify much risk in the first place. So I think, the past administrations, plural, have been much better about working with industry as complicated programs rolled out. I remember in 2014 with the sectoral program, OFAC spent countless hours with industry to try and walk through the concerns of how this program would roll out. I guess the more recent example were the Chinese securities, the DoD CMCC list, that obviously had a few glitches in how that was rolled out, and certainly created some compliance issues. But so long as the government is providing clarity on how to achieve compliance and to identify some of these issues, I think that partnership is critical. The U.S. is probably worse than most other countries around the world in really having true public-private partnership on some of these issues. It's still somewhat at arm's length between the policymakers and the actual regulated institutions.
And I wonder if there's scope to argue whether there's some people in Washington who might prefer a bit of regulatory ambiguity because it actually expands the impact of sanctions.
It absolutely does. I mean, there's something to be said, which to another point that isn't often mentioned is there's something to be said for confusion in a program and what that does to market reaction as well. Make something confusing enough, and we saw this with sectoral. You're not just going to impact a few companies, you can impact several markets more broadly because people just don't understand how to comply. I do remember in the early days of the program in 2014, you had some companies that just abandoned Russia outright for a few weeks because they could not figure out how to work within the confines of the law. So I think you're spot on that sometimes confusion brings some of these issues that may be the intended, unintended consequences of the programs.
Thank you, Dan. I want to just pose this last question before we run out of time. Chris, we started the discussion, with sanctions that are related to Navalny's poisoning and current incarceration. Can you sort of give us your take on where things stand on Navalny? Obviously, he is imprisoned, he's been sentenced. Where does the domestic anti-government sentiment stand? What are you expecting from Navalny's movement? Are you anticipating any major developments around Navalny and his group this year?
I think I think there are two big questions, actually. One is with regard to the next big political event on the calendar in Russia, which is the Duma elections this fall, which no one expects will be free and fair, but nevertheless will be sort of contested in Russian style. Navalny's allies almost certainly won't be allowed to run for Duma seats if they have any chance of winning. But nevertheless, that will provide a focal point for discontent when, as I expect, the ruling parties and who are supported by them win a majority in the Duma, as will almost certainly happen. That will be a focal point for discontent around which Navalny's team can potentially rally support. So that's a predictable event. I think the unpredictable event is what happens to Navalny personally. As of right now, it seems like he's going to be in prison for the next couple of years per the Russian court decision. But I think we've got to recognize that our confidence in our ability to predict what the Russian security services do next to Navalny is really quite low. Very few people, I don't think, would have predicted that they would have tried to kill him with a chemical weapon in Russia last summer. It still is sort of difficult to put together in my head why then with that tactic, and then why they failed in the end to pull it off. And so with that uncertainty about what's happened over the last 9 months, vis-a-vis the security services approach to Navalny, I think we ought to be very uncertain in our views as to what comes next. And I could easily imagine, although I hope it doesn't happen, something worse happening to Navalny. And if that was the case, that would almost certainly spur a new discussion in the West about further sanctions and a further deterioration in the U.S. Russia relationship. It's a big uncertainty, and it's not just an unpredictability. We just really can't know what's going to happen next. It could happen tomorrow. It could never happen. We just don't know. But I think we've got to be considering that as something that could really spur change in U.S.-Russian relations and the sanctions program as a result.
I think that's such a great way to sort of end today's discussion. We don't quite know what to expect, but whatever happens, I think our audience members can count on FPRI that we will be covering it. We will be writing about it and talking about it. So Dan, Chris, thank you so much for joining me today. I would like to thank our audience again for joining us today, for being so active. For those of you who know FPRI and who are our donors and members, thank you for your support. But for those of you who are new, who have not yet signed up for our emails, I strongly recommend that you consider becoming a member of FPRI and that you donate to our organization so that we can keep doing the kind of cutting edge research that we've been doing on Russia, the Middle East, and plenty of national security issues, Asia, Africa, so on and so forth. So again, thank you, Dan, thank you, Chris, thank you to our audience, and I hope to see everyone in our next event.